Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm Alex Ambrose, a policy analyst here at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. I want to welcome you to today's panel, How Should Congress Keep Children Safe Online? Some child safety advocates argue that the internet, and particularly social media, is responsible for a vast array of potential harms to younger users, including but not limited to bullying, addiction, sexual exploitation, and poor physical and mental health outcomes such as depression, body image disorders, self-harm, and a lack of physical activity and exercise. On the other hand, the internet and social media can and have improved young people's lives, connecting them with entertainment, education, and community. Ensuring young people get the best possible online experience balancing safety with utility is difficult, considering every child and teenager has different needs and faces unique circumstances. Recently, we've seen policymakers build momentum to legislate children's online safety. The Senate has shown strong support by passing the Kids Online Safety and Privacy Act, or COSPA, while the House is working on its own version. However, lawmakers remain divided on the best path forward. And we've seen waves of interest in legislating in this arena ebb and flow, as recently as this past weekend when KOSA, or the Kids Online Safety Act's authors, Senators Blumenthal and Blackburn, released an updated version of KOSA in the hopes of pushing the legislation through before the new Congress and new administration. And don't worry, we will get to the nuances of that legislation in a moment. But while many view KOSA as an answer to protecting minors from harmful content on social media, some also see it as an avenue for censorship. And these new calls to pass KOSA these past few days further reiterate the importance of having discussions like this one to talk about the debate within these issues. And so I want to jump right in. And before I introduce our panel, I want to remind you that you can ask questions throughout the conversation via the Slido link on the event webpage on ITIF's website or in the description box on YouTube. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists onto the screen. We have with us today Bailey Sanchez, Senior Counsel for U.S. Legislation at the Future of Privacy Forum, Andrew Zach, Policy Manager at the Family Online Safety Institute, John Moots, the Senior Policy and Research Manager from Children and Screens, and Shay Gardner, Director of Policy and Research at LGBT Tech. Now, I know I'm a bit biased because I organized this webinar, but I really think the group we've got assembled here are some of the most intelligent and influential voices in the children's online safety policy landscape. I'm thrilled that they're here, and I think this is going to be a wonderful conversation. So I'll start off with some questions for our panel to talk about the state of play, what we're seeing in DC around children's online safety, and leave some room at the end for audience questions. So with that, I wanted to start with an introduction of the major bills we're seeing around children's online safety that I mentioned at the top, which would certainly be KOSA and COPPA 2.0 in this Senate bill that passed COSPA. I have to shout out Bailey because she has written fantastic pieces for FPF on the differences between this text and the version that ultimately passed. So Bailey, if I can first turn to you, can you lay out those major differences you're seeing in the bills, maybe especially with this brand new version that just came out this past weekend?
Sure. So still trying to decide what we're calling it, KOSA, COSPA, COPPA 2.0. So as you mentioned, COSPA is a kids privacy and safety package. So there are actually three titles to it. Title one is the Kids Online Safety Act. Title two is the Filter Bubble Transparency Act, which we probably aren't going to talk about here today. And then Title three is COPPA 2.0. So I can really quickly cover COPPA 2.0 because it's a fairly straightforward bill. That one is, as the name suggests, focused on amending COPPA, which only applies to children up to 13. So that would include some privacy protections for 13 to 16-year-olds. And it would also ban targeted advertising to children and teens. So that's kind of the main thing it does. It's really focused on privacy and how data flows online and focused on the advertising piece. Whereas KOSA, which is, I think, a lot more of the focus of probably what we'll be discussing today, I think is a really novel type of bill. It's focused on design and platform safety. And so that is more targeted towards social services. So, like if you just go to a news organization, that's very likely not to be covered. But any place that a child is likely to interact online is probably covered by KOSA. And so that provides some default design and safety settings. And really the goal of it is to provide tools for minors, but also importantly, tools for parents, and to turn some certain things off by default. So the concerns animating COSA are more focused on, like the, like addicting behaviors online. So, like no autoplay or infinite scroll by default. And that's really kind of like the gist of the package. So again, COPPA 2.0 really focused on data privacy very specifically, whereas COSA I think is really focused on kind of trying to combat more of like the mental health or like addiction type harms of platforms. So very, very like squishy amorphous issue, which is why COSA takes such a novel approach.
I love that squishy and amorphous issues. Well, and there's certainly so many issues that you address there that I'm sure we're going to cover through the scope of this conversation. So for the rest of the panel, from your perspectives, I know you've all been in this space for a while and are tracking a lot of those issues. So I'm curious for you, how has this sort of evolved over the past year? This ebb and flow, like I talked about at the top. What are those? What do you make of those changes and those issues that Bailey mentioned, and kind of what's top of mind for you? And Andrew, if I can kick it to you first.
Totally. And thank you. And yeah, always really appreciate Bailey's close reading and thorough analysis of the many changes and combinations to these bills or this set of bills. Um, for that little background, Congress has been working on COSA for more than 3 years. Since the initial Frances Haugen Facebook whistleblower hearings that inspired the bill. And we're now, this is the closest it's come to becoming law after a 91-3 vote to pass the Senate. And support has grown over the past year with parents groups, safety advocates, and mental health advocates pushing the House to act now that the Senate has acted. It's kind of stuck in the House, including at a rally yesterday. There was a rally here in DC to urge passage in the final 2+ weeks of the year. And look, this is a really hard and nuanced issue. You have on the one side grieving parents who say that if COSA was already law, my child would be alive today. Pass this now to save future children. And on the other hand, you have civil rights groups saying that if this law passes, queer and marginalized youth could be cut off from supportive communities and even be at higher risk for significant mental health effects, including self-harm. So it's a really difficult where both sides of this discussion have valid points. And it's worth having these conversations because if COSA does pass, or COSPA, or whatever combination of it, lawmakers and then, of course, the regulators will need to understand the potential for all of these unintended consequences and hopefully mitigate them.
Yeah, Shay, can I kick it to you next?
Yeah, I think that's actually the perfect segue, into how I'd approach this question. Our perspective at LGBT Tech is always centralized around, protecting LGBTQ plus youth online, their privacy, their security, their autonomy as appropriate. And one of the really big shifts that I've actually seen since election day is, the concerns that we've discussed in the conversations we've been having in a largely hypothetical manner have really now become seen as a likely reality, or at least a very real possibility. uh, you know, through history and to this day, those who oppose LGBTQ plus rights have really incorrectly and cruelly claimed that exposure for youth to LGBTQ plus existence and expression is really inherently to harm them. And now we're heading into 2025 with a very different looking sort of federal government, and a lot of individuals who will be in the position to make decisions, about online platforms and the content they host, did run very openly, being against youth exposure to LGBTQ plus expression and resources and content. So it's sort of talking about a shift in the conversation. I think at this point in that conversation, I really encourage people not to downplay the seriousness of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and thank you for bringing that up. John, is there anything else that you'd like to touch on as this kind of conversation about children's online safety has morphed?
Yeah, thank you. Regarding the entire kind of mental health conversation that I think a lot of this is centered around and those concerns about mental health harms, I've seen a really big shift in the nuance in the conversation around the whole issue. At Children's Screens, we really focus on the research behind this and the evidence is quite messy and squishy. That's what social sciences are. And in the past, especially year, there's been this acknowledgement and this acceptance that the data are messy and that approaching this is going to be a little less clear cut than we thought it was going to be. And more so than any maybe scientific conversation I've been involved in. My background's in neuroscience. I was an academic for a while, and I haven't seen this kind of public debate about the nuance of the research in such an honest, open way before. I also am really hopeful at the increase in youth voices that have been folded into the conversation. That's been a massive shift since 2 years ago when this version was first introduced. That's been, there can always be more, but it's been more accepted and more prominent, especially in the past 6 months to a year. That's been a really positive, I think, optimistic change that I've seen.
Yeah, I completely agree. And that kind of youth piece and incorporating youth voices, hopefully we'll be able to talk more about later in our conversation. But I think part of what we've sort of started to talk about a lot is just the various roles of a lot of these different groups in legislating this. And so parents, I think, are certainly one of those pieces. And also we were kind of discussing the role of the platforms themselves. And so I think that's been, when we're speaking specifically about COSA, kind of one of those pieces that's been, to use the word that we've been throwing around today, squishy. I love that. I'm going to keep using that. I think that's a great way to say it. And so, that's the provision in COSA, I think, has been maybe the most debated or argued. And for any kind of non-policy wonks tuning in, this duty of care is essentially putting the legal onus on the platforms to address children's online harms, like John was mentioning, the kind of mental health harms. And so Bailey has sort of addressed that as well when she was talking about these changes. And like we said, the red line changes that FPF does are super, super helpful to point out these changes. But I just wanted to ask you all, how are you kind of viewing the role of these various groups and the role of this duty of care? And what do you think is sort of the best approach to that? And John, if I can kick it back to you first to start.
Yeah, thanks for handing me the controversial issue first. But no, I think we've already kind of level set that this doesn't have a really clear-cut answer. We are in a little bit of a realm of speculation right now. These kinds of laws haven't been passed in the United States before. This is the duty of care is a novel application of the concept in the United States. So the language passed by the Senate and the updated language that we've seen holds the duty of care with the enforcement of the duty of care with the FTC. That was an intentional change from a previous version in which state AGs could enforce the duty of care in response to those censorship concerns, specifically that states will have a variety of different interpretations of what causes mental health harms to minors. I think the duty of care is a pretty bold and honest attempt at doing something that's really tricky with tech regulation. Digital tech is a really fast-paced, ever evolving kind of space, and it's really hard to write a policy that will appropriately apply to future technologies or future uses of technology, even in like the next 5 years or maybe even the next year. So one approach is to be broad and non-prescriptive, capturing all sorts of intents and outcomes more than specific uses. And the duty of care kind of tries to do that. It says, if you have particular designs that have that kids are interacting with, the platform has to try to mitigate particular harms. And they've played around with a different language on what those harms could be. And many of them are already encoded into law. It's just application of these particular designs. I think the really sticky part is you have to try to mitigate certain mental health harms like anxiety and depression. And like I said, the data around that are actually a little less clear cut. And even for academics, there's some debate over causal links. But generally speaking, there's a pretty good evidence that heavy social media use is linked to things like anxiety and depression. The flip side of this kind of approach is that if it's too vague, there's concerns that the law can be leveraged, like people have said, for political purposes, or could even be so broad as to be unenforceable or unconstitutional, which has been something that we've heard echoed a number of times. So the duty of care that is written right now attempts to strike this balance. Whether or not it would do so is, again, kind of speculative, but we have some signals from laws in other countries, like the UK's age-appropriate design codes, that kind of signal that something like a duty of care could be helpful. Children's screens and the digital futures for children out of the London School of Economics. We've both published reports that found pretty much the same thing in response to the age appropriate design codes in the UK, which do have a duty of care like provision in them. And there hasn't been over moderation in response to that. In fact, you see kind of like these weird little novel approaches that platforms will try to do using the tools that they have to align themselves with that duty of care. So yeah, I think, again, kind of a realm of speculation. Overall, though, because the controversial provision is kind of messy and the research is still kind of messy, our stance has always been that in order to enforce this properly and ethically, if it does pass, or to write it ethically and properly, we need better research and we need better evidence. And so that's going to have to be a priority if we want to start regulating these spaces in a really thoughtful way.
Thank you so much for giving such a balanced overview of that. That was really helpful. And I completely agree with the research piece, and hopefully we can talk about that more as well. But Shay, I wanted to kick it to you and get your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, that was actually very, very well done covering kind of the spectrum of thoughts around duty of care. For us, the two big issues are always going to come down to the vagueness and the subjectivity of it. You know, we really don't want platforms to end up in a situation where they are taking down massive amounts of not only valuable but constitutionally protected content in an attempt to meet a really vague and subjective standard of what accounts for care. And I think, you know, actually the FTC enforcement piece was brought up. Initially, when we were having these conversations, it was around state attorneys generals being able to sort of make that call on if a duty of care had not been met. And we really did not want state AGs who spoke really openly about content in books being harmful to children, having the ability to decide that content in online spaces also fit that standard. Uh, we know that FTC enforcement was then brought up as a potential solution and is kind of where we currently sit. Well, just yesterday, the likely incoming head of the FTC, Commissioner Andrew Ferguson, his written pitch to the incoming president was published yesterday. And in that pitch, he outlined how he would, quote unquote, fight back against the trans agenda as the head of the FTC. So, you know, that is someone really saying what we see as the quiet part out loud.
Thank you for bringing that up. And I know with the new text of COSA that came out this past weekend, Senator Blackburn was also talking about the FTC and the role that FTC will or won't play in that enforcement piece. So thank you for bringing that up, Shay. Bailey, Andrew, I wanted to give you a chance to, if you had any other additional thoughts as well. Bailey, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so I like to compare the duty of care to what the states have done. So this is kind of like a little known part of Connecticut's consumer data privacy law, but it actually just went into effect in October. They have their own duty of care in their law. So they took the age appropriate design code and really modified it and slotted it into their existing consumer privacy framework. So their duty of care, so it's a duty of care, but I would agree with John that I think what COSA specifically is doing is novel. The way that Connecticut approached their duty of care was just to say, you know, platforms should use reasonable care to avoid any heightened risk of harm to minors. And then the harms that they define are kind of like very traditional, like tort law harms, like privacy harms, like no unfair treatment, no financial, physical, or reputational injury to minors. So I think that there has been a concern from other lawmakers that are interested in this idea that, you know, like those harms, like what do those mean? They sound very like old fashioned, very legalese. But I think on the flip side, you know, we have lots of case law in states about how those harms apply. Like I'm not an expert in Connecticut tort law, but I would imagine that there's like case law out there on like what intrusion upon seclusion means in Connecticut. And I think the approach that COSA is taking is trying to, you know, identify more modern harms. But the downside to that approach is, you know, again, this is kind of an experiment. We don't know exactly how it'll go. It is quite vague, and so There was an update over the weekend, as we mentioned, and they added a new harm like diagnosable depression disorders. So that is much more specific than what it used to be. But that's new. That's not something we have in other states or federally to compare it to. But then there's still kind of like more vague harms in the bill, like, and it's not just avoid harm, it's prevent and mitigate. So does that mean, that's another open question, is like, do platforms need to actively prevent online bullying on their platform? I think that would be a lofty good thing to do, but I think we've had this issue of like teens bullying each other since the beginning of time, so it's hard to kind of like proactively do that from a platform. So I would just say I think those are really the two big differences. Is so Connecticut and Colorado. Colorado passed a similar duty of care, just hasn't gone into effect yet. They take a very like classic old-fashioned approach, which may not meet our modern harms, but on the same time, there's a lot more like case law to rely on to kind of scope out what those harms mean.
I'll join in. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I love learning from fellow panelists, in real time. So genuinely, those were excellent answers. Thank you. And I think I'm glad we started talking about, age appropriate design as well as the duty of care, because we want to get away from just debating whether specific content is harmful or not, like getting into the broader ideas and design structures, where, whether that's a duty of care or like safety and or privacy by design and default settings, or an actual age appropriate design, something that gets beyond the is this regulating protected speech question, because that's where a lot of laws, especially state laws, which we can get into as well, have run into problems. And I know we mentioned the FTC and state AGs, and I mean, look, at the end of the day, someone needs to enforce the law. And it does seem like the FTC is probably the best option here and most consistent instead of state by state variability. And I would argue that we need to make sure it's fully funded and well resourced and staffed with technologists, child development psychologists, other experts to bring about actually effective enforcement actions. But if the law is not complied with, it's not going to be effective. So I'd like to see a really well equipped and knowledgeable expert agency like the FTC leading on this.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for bringing that up again as well. And I completely agree that I love panels like this because I also get to learn it in real time as well. And being able to talk through these things is very helpful. And I know we've sort of so far talked about federal legislation, but as you both, Bailey and Angie, were sort of starting to talk about, we're also seeing states take up the mantle for a lot of these issues, especially as it relates to privacy. We're seeing more and more calls for social media bans or social media labeling. And so for us at ITIF, we're sort of seeing this shift towards state legislation further contributing to this patchwork of conflicting laws. And obviously, the ways that we are experiencing the internet is not starting and stopping at state borders. And so I'm just curious for all of you, what are kind of your perspectives on how states are taking up this mantle versus the federal government? Shay, if I can kick it to you first to start.
Yeah, of course. Thinking about the states, I think I'd actually like to share a perspective specifically on states that really have taken on this mantle with a lens to protecting LGBTQ plus rights, states like New York or California. Because that's something we hear is like, well, in those states, of course, you're right. So there would be an effort to sort of preserve access to that really valuable content online. And so when we look at these states, I really encourage the legislators in them to consider that where states like New York and California go, others follow. So this influence really means that New York or California's choices in digital policy don't just impact the residents of that state. They kind of set this precedent nationwide, and less well-meaning legislators are going to adopt similar legislation, strip away a few really valuable protections, and we really fear ending up in a situation where discriminatory policies are being passed under the guise of following New York or California or states like its example. So it is something we urge a lot of caution to state legislators to, is we really ask them not to lend credibility to similar laws elsewhere that lack the critical protections that they might have prioritized. Um, I don't want my whole conversation today to just be, no, 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 you can't do these. You can't do anything. I think there is actually one space where states have a really unique ability to step in ways the federal government would struggle to, and that is on the point of digital literacy. I think states are really able to better recognize and address the needs and the situations of their residents. When it comes to teaching individuals how to protect themselves and others online and how to be better digital stewards. And so I really encourage state legislators to consider that piece of it in this larger conversation.
I completely agree. And I hope as well that we can touch on digital literacy a bit more in this conversation as well, because completely agree that that's kind of that piece that is crucial, not just for states, but federal government. It's something that we can kind of talk about in lots of different arenas. So thank you for bringing that back up, Shay. John, can I pitch it to you next?
Yeah, thank you. And I appreciate that word of caution, Shay, about taking a law from one state and just applying it to another one, assuming the same kinds of intentions. I think it kind of speaks to the need for a good, thoughtful federal policy. We've seen California and New York are really good examples of kind of these thoughtful approaches as well. Speaking of age-appropriate design codes, California was the first one to pass those in the United States. They're under injunction right now. However, we've seen them passed in Maryland and Vermont. Vermont was vetoed, but Maryland's have actually gone into effect, and so we'll see the effects of those fairly soon. New York and California have also passed recently laws that restrict the use of personalized feeds and recommendation systems for minors specifically, and I've been really impressed with how the New York Attorney General has gone about soliciting comments on how to enforce that particular guideline. So I think that the states right now are really operating as that proverbial, laboratory of democracy, and they're testing out a bunch of different types of approaches, from outright bans to really more kind of scalpels, and trying to carve out these particular harmful design features that we see. I do think, again, and I'm going to be kind of a broken record throughout this, that if you want to do that, you're going to have research and really invest in that research and really try to study the impacts of the laws that you have. I do think that the personalized recommendation system restrictions are a pretty valuable approach, and that the age-appropriate design codes are a pretty valuable approach as well. And it will be really interesting to see how those play out in the next year or so.
Great. Thank you for bringing age-appropriate design codes into the conversation as well. Hopefully we can touch on that too. Andrew.
Sure. Thank you. No, this is great. And I in agreement on a lot of this, but yeah, Congress has done so little in this space, at least so far. There's still time at the end of the year. I know it's tight, but that really all the major online safety and privacy action has come at the state level. And, that's a mixed bag. As John was already mentioning, a bunch of attempts have been blocked in the courts or at least stalled. And so, yeah, ultimately a patchwork of different state laws to govern the internet is not the best approach here, but it is turning into a bit of a reality. And so, as Shay said, we're working to share some of the best practices we found with state policymakers to find, if not consensus, then at least some sort of harmonization where it can, if you comply, if a company complies with a similar law in one state, that would also carry over to another state. And that gets trickier going state by state than even country by country, which presents its own problems. And yeah, I think John mentioned a couple as well, but when the sort of big all-encompassing bills get stuck, like an age-appropriate design code, we have seen some narrower laws make progress and succeed, at least so far. One that we point to a lot is child influencer laws, especially for financial compensation, where it's a bit of an updated digital child actors law that started in Illinois and a couple of states like California have passed as well. As Shay said, also like states' opportunities to get in sort of the school district wide cell phone policies, not having sort of the national law about schools and treating every school the same, especially elementary school kids are quite different than high school kids. So having some variability and growth and responsibilities. And then on the trends that John mentioned about New York and California, it's interesting to go after sort of the algorithmic feeds focusing on addiction, and again trying to get beyond speech and content debates. And so I know New York has been pretty thoughtful. I know we had an event there ourselves, and want to see, thought that was a pretty good example of thoughtful back and forth through crafting a policy, and hopefully thoughtful engagement continuing from the AG's office.
Thank you so much. There were so many great pieces I want to touch on in not just your answer, everyone's answers. And I'm really glad that you brought up that child influencer piece. That's been, I think, a quieter part of the conversation, but one that's really important, and one that, I've written about a bunch to plug myself. And there's some pieces on the ITIF website that I've written about child influencers. I think that's a really important conversation to have. So thank you for bringing that up in this context. And Bailey, I know we were talking this week as well, just about states' influence, and like Andrew was saying, that states might be that kind of arena that you can get your foot in the door maybe a little bit easier than all of the nitty gritty of the federal government. So just wanted to give you an opportunity to add any other comments that you might have.
Yeah, I think my other co-panelists covered everything pretty well, so I'll just make it quick. The way I think about states versus federally is, at the states, there's a good chance something will pass, especially in the kids space. All focus was on AI last year. Ultimately, it was just the Colorado AI Act that passed. But in the meantime, while everyone else was paying attention to AI, we were all looking at the handful of bills that did pass in the states, specifically on kids' privacy and safety. Like Virginia's session is only like 2 months long. They indicated a strong effort to pass something again in 2025. I do think the challenge, though, of states being the laboratory of democracies, I think we'll get to a point where, once they start to come into effect, if they do, because we mentioned quite a few of them are in the courts, is that some of the state approaches just don't align with each other. Like, I think the age appropriate design codes kind of take a more child first approach, whereas another opposing trend we've seen is the focus on parents' rights. And that's kind of the solution that some states have taken, is really to put the parent in control of making all the decisions. I think there's a lot of sense behind that when you think of like really young kids. Back in my day, we had our desktop computer like in the living room. My parents could see it, but I think that kind of approach looks a lot different when a teenager is 16, 17. At that age, you're able to drive a car. So the parents' rights approach versus like kids having their own privacy rights, it might not be in the best interest of a child to have a parent like really overseeing all their choices online. So that's something I'll be watching going into 2025, is how, are these two kind of like really main opposing models going to come to a head at some point?
Absolutely. And it's funny you bring up the family computer. That's kind of an analogy that we use at ITIF a lot of, if we were to talk about children's online safety in the future of immersive technologies. And right now, a lot of kind of headsets are in that family computer stage, if there's only one for the whole family. So your comment just reminded me of that we might not touch on that in this conversation, but just that, thinking about the evolution of a lot of these issues, starting from back in the family computer stage. But I kind of wanted to get a little bit more into this nitty gritty of some of the pieces that you all have been talking about. I want to maybe get to that kind of the parental side of things, and have maybe Andrew and John talk about that. And then also what we've sort of started talking about with this age appropriate design codes. And I think that's one of those sticky or squishy debates about children's online safety, is what to do about age assurance and age verification, which is making sure a user is the age that they say they are. And I think that might be tricky, as we've been talking about, because at least from my perspective, there's no real good answer. Some techniques balance privacy better than others, and some are more trusting of young users than others. So I'm curious for you, Shay and Bailey, from your perspectives, how are you approaching these age assurance or age verification proposals? And what do you think is kind of the best way to think about that? Shay, if I can pitch it to you first.
Yeah, I think you probably started to cover it there, but there's, really currently no solid age verification method that actually covers the entirety of the population and does it in a privacy protective way. When we talk about age verification, we have to realize we're not just talking about minors, because to identify that that is a group of individuals within the population, you have to age verify everybody, and you have to identity verify everybody. Excuse me. Whether you are 15 or 95, it hits everyone across the population, and we see that as a humongous privacy risk. Um, Especially when we think about the fact that the most common answer to age verification that we see out there, the most commonly thrown idea is government ideas is implementing age verification that way, and we are really concerned that that does not account for the fact that marginalized and young folks are least likely to have government IDs, or it's only one statistic, but we know that 43% of trans folks in the United States don't have an accurate ID, and states, many states across the country are really working to make that sort of identification completely infeasible. So the reason I bring up, young folks, marginalized folks, trans folks, these are our most vulnerable youth, and these are really the ones who are going to feel the pain of poorly implemented or over stringent age verification measures.
Yeah, Bailey.
Yeah, in terms of thinking about age assurance as a policy proposal, as setting aside the technology part of the conversation, I do find it hard to conceive of like a legislative proposal that kind of like meets constitutional muster, just because as Shay mentioned, to a lot of the age assurance proposals do require doing it for everyone because you need to sort who is a kid versus who's not. And so that's going to implicate the rights of adults as much as children. And then another piece of that, in terms of it being overbroad, is that it can sometimes be under-inclusive as well, because the proposals might be focused specifically on social media. This was actually kind of the crux of the Arkansas litigation and that preliminary injunction, just because of how they scoped social media. Like, if you are kind of narrowly tailoring the harm, like the harm you're trying to solve for is social media is harming children, then you need to kind of include all social media and make sure that's scoped appropriately. But it's kind of very hard to define what is social media. It's also something that changes regularly. So it's going to be hard to include something that is focusing on all the harms online. And then something that the court also raised is, like, is social media the only place that kids are being harmed online? Or are there other places? So from a policy perspective, I just don't know if age assurance is the solution. Age assurance can certainly be a tool in the toolbox to, get at some other underlying harms. But in terms of it being like kind of the focus of a policy proposal, I haven't like seen a whole lot that are really successful, to be honest, and won't raise constitutional questions. And from my perspective, some of the age assurance proposals, that's really all the bill does. And so it doesn't change kind of like the underlying protections online. So, once a child has been able to go through that age assurance, and once an adult has, it doesn't necessarily change any of the platform behaviors or design features or make it less safer. It's really just focused on the gate. So once you've unlocked that gate, you might still be entering a place that can be inappropriate for a certain demographic.
Thank you for bringing all of that up. I like the gate analogy too. So, and Andrew and John, I will let you comment on that as well if you're interested. But I also want to talk about another piece that we've been speaking about, which is kind of the role of parents. And I know Andrew Fosse's been talking about that a lot, and the role of parental controls, maybe moving past parental controls, and just sort of, can you expand a bit on how you're thinking about those issues? And if there's anything about age assurance as well that you want to talk about, please feel free.
Sure, great. Yeah, that's going to be maybe a longer one. No, absolutely. I mean, with age assurance, so just very briefly, we call age assurance the collection of age verification, estimation, and age gate technology or processes. So age assurance we talk about as the whole system. And everyone's been right so far. There is no silver bullet. This is a trade-off between privacy and safety, or as we've called it, invasiveness and effectiveness, where to be more accurate, you need to give more personal information. And so that's a trade-off to consider across how risky any content or platform is. We've done some research and white paper, all available for free on FOSI.org, as well as to highlight Bailey's work at FPF's infographic is pretty great on this. And I mean, technological development here in this space is happening. It is exciting. It's possible to get better technology in the near future to help. And it's still not the only solution. It's a tool in the toolbox. And to take Bailey's points, but we think having a data privacy law in place lowers the stakes for age assurance, where people are more trusting and happy to give their personal information for age assurance purposes if there were better and clearer limits on what companies could do with that. Collection limitations, use limitations, retention limitations. So privacy doesn't have to come first before safety, but it might be helpful in this instance. Jumping to parental controls. So yeah, FOSI has a lot of research in a number of areas. A couple of years ago is parental controls. Just Monday, we released research on digital well-being. Also recently, Gen AI, as well as ongoing online safety survey of teens and their families. And the thing that jumps out the most and one of our most consistent findings across all of these topics is the answer to who is most responsible for online safety. It is always parents is number one and kids is number two. And so the perception is that it's focused on the families here to solve this. Definitely not alone, part of a larger ecosystem. But we found that internationally as well, not just in the US. What's also been great about these parental controls or broader conversations is that people are having these conversations. Families report very high percentages of them actually talking with their kids together about online safety. The question here that we're going to explore in future research is, what exactly are they talking about? We want to have better insight into those conversations and better empower families to have these conversations. You know, we've got our own resources, our good digital parenting resources about online safety agreements, device-specific contracts, platform-specific parental control guides, and the Kids Online Health and Safety Task Force that came out with their, I thought, really thoughtful and thorough and good and well-researched report just this year, offers their own very similar resources about here's how to have these conversations as a family, where everyone wants to move beyond parents yelling at kids to get off their phones. And on the company side, parental controls do need to be more accessible and more streamlined. We have to make it easier for parents to access them with limited information and limited time. I know that was a lot.
No, that was fantastic, and I completely agree with that. And to comment on that research that you released on Monday, one of the pieces, and John was talking about it earlier as well, one of the pieces from the research I thought was really fascinating was that the teens and children themselves were saying that they view their responsibility as very important as well. And so it was that self authority that I thought was a really fantastic insight from your research. John, I know we've got a lot of things that we were touching on, so anything you'd like to add as well?
Yeah, well, I think all the things said about age assurance kind of covered the bases and were really good, and I want to agree with them all. The parental controls component is something we think about a lot here. There's really no good evidence that parental controls themselves are going to be a solution, but parental involvement is really, really important, and that seems to be the key. And parental controls are kind of a tool in the parenting, caregiving tool belt to help with digital parenting. Restrictive parenting, really permissive parenting, both of them yield pretty undesirable results. They tend to relate to higher problematic social media use, worse child caregiver relationships, especially like restrictive parenting. But communication seems to be key. And above all else, above parental controls, above monitoring. And you really got at that, Andrew. I think that these conversations are happening and they're really, really important. Even at a really young age, they provide some buy-in for the kid in whatever kind of rules that you lay out. They also help build autonomy and agency. And as somebody gets older, you're just not going to be able to monitor them or restrict their use as much as a caregiver might think they need to be. So having a person develop agency and autonomy is really important and part of growing up, and it tends to yield the best results. I think the concern we have is that it's really difficult to do that in the current digital landscape, in the current digital environment, that there are a lot of actors working against kids and families, and there are a lot of rights that are getting kind of infringed on, in the interest of business practices. And so building legislation that protects those rights so that people, that parents can help develop healthy kind of digital literacy and digital citizenship for their kids and their teens is really, really important. It doesn't mean restricting necessarily. I'm not trying to be particularly prescriptive on what that legislation would look like, but creating a landscape in which kids can develop optimally, in which they can explore their identities, in which they can find information, and grow and develop online, because everything is now done online in a digital space. So, they have to be allowed to develop that agency and autonomy in a healthy, productive way.
I'm so grateful that you brought digital literacy up. I really appreciate that. And I just want to be cognizant of time, because I know we've got some audience questions rolling in. So a reminder that you can submit audience questions via the Slido link on our webpage or the YouTube description box. And so I want to address a comment that came in that I think is really great, which is asking about COSA's inclusion of the personalized recommendation system as a design feature. And this question is saying that that sort of blurs the line between the design and content regulation. And they're asking, how can legislators address this and fix this? So wanted to pitch that to the group. If you have any ideas, please jump in there. Bailey.
I'm going to go first because I'm going to take the easy answer and see if anyone else has a more substantive answer. I think the easy answer is I don't know. I think this is a very valid question. And I think this is actually a question that has come up in reference to the Safe for Kids Act also. I think it's hard to kind of like thread that needle between personalized recommendation system that's really focused on like the data practices versus the content practices. And I think, I am not a First Amendment expert. I increasingly am reading more and more First Amendment work as these laws get into litigation, but I have not seen like a clear-cut answer on this topic. And so I'm saying I don't know, not just because I personally don't know, but to me, this seems to be a fairly like novel question that I think we'll just have to kind of like wait and see how it plays out. But interested to hear from my other co-panelists if they know the answer to this question.
Yeah, John, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, and first, I don't have an answer. I'm really sorry. Because this is a blurry, complicated issue. But I think an interesting starting place is thinking about things, at least recommendation systems and all settings, through the lens of operator versus user-driven, and using that as a starting point and saying, all right, so are we just concerned about operator-driven recommendation systems? We don't want to include all those user-driven recommendation systems. So if you're following accounts, if you're selecting content, the intent shouldn't be, and oftentimes isn't, to tell you what content you should be looking at. It's to prevent the unasked for recommendation of content that could be harmful. So I think there's maybe a good starting point by trying to delineate at least what is operator driven and solely operator driven, and what is solely user driven. And then obviously, as technology continues to evolve rapidly and these trends evolve rapidly, there is some convergence, and I don't have a really good clear-cut answer as to what to do with that convergence, but that's at least one way we've started to kind of think about things.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you. Shay.
Yeah, this again, I wish I had an answer, but again, it's a sort of, we're all taking guesses a bit. But I just want to say, when we're talking about these sort of recommendations, we know that hate and harassment doesn't live, in the vacuum of algorithms or on online platforms. We know that it is bigotry and bad behavior of the real world that is being replicated in digital forms. And we know that platforms have an obligation to sort of work against that replication. But it is, I encourage in this conversation that we don't take curation tools away from users who are able to curate their experiences away from the hate and harassment. I would argue, I think in all situations, putting more curation tools and putting more education about the platforms and about how to use those tools in the hands of the users is only going to benefit everyone on the platform.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm just going to be quick because I was going to say similar to what Shay said, and I thought John's point was really great. And I know Shay and I have talked about this, but like the benefits of creating a customized online experience and to make it safer and friendlier and happier and more entertaining and educational and thoughtful and just overall better. And that's the flip side of the parental controls. Parental controls are great, more useful when they're a younger kid. Online safety tools or user customized tools are really important for platforms to offer as well. So I like that distinction of, where's the curated experience coming from? If it's from the users choosing how to engage, that's a positive.
Absolutely. Completely agree. Well, and this next question, I think, ties to actually what we were talking about at the very top of the call, which is, one of the things that I think we can praise policymakers on with COSA in particular, but just a lot of this legislation is the inclusion of youth voices themselves in this process, which I think is extremely important, and to have their opinions kind of be involved in this legislation. So with COSA, for example, I know there's this council that will have youth representatives with experience in child online safety. So for all of you, do you have any advice on how we can best include a diverse range of voices in these policy conversations? Are there any ways that you found have been successful or unsuccessful, and what can we all be doing better to amplify those voices? Anyone have any initial thoughts?
I can jump in really fast.
Please.
I think first and foremost, we have to seek out young people and ask them and be very intentional about it. That hasn't always been done in every state. That hasn't always been done in federal legislation when it, in its early stages. So be intentional and ask kids what they're doing. As much as I will promote the research side of things, researchers are notorious for studying things but not actually asking the thing itself what it's doing. Adolescents, kids, young adults, they know best how they're using these devices, how they're using social media, and they should be engaged. And I want to add the extra caveat that that also means intentionally making sure that your samples are representative, that you're not just sampling from white middle class families, that you're sampling from the whole spectrum of kids, because they, as the research shows, different demographics use social media differently with different outcomes, and so you really want to get the full spectrum of those outcomes.
I think I probably have two recommendations in interacting with kind of young voices on this issue. The first is really not to infantilize them in the conversation. I think every single generation of users that comes after, understands the technology 10 times better than the one that came before it. And we have to kind of keep that in mind and not assume that we understand it, I think, better than they do. And my second recommendation is really not to treat youth like a monolith in this conversation. We talk a lot about under 18 and over 18, but we know that there's no magic switch that flips when you turn 18, where you are suddenly filled with digital literacy, and can really understand how to navigate and open the internet and platform access. So understanding that the needs of youth evolve at different ages, and even those ages aren't standardized, when an experience might be more appropriate for one youth than another. So kind of recognizing, to sum that up, no infantilizing, and don't treat them like a monolith.
Yeah, I was going to add really quickly that this was actually one of the things in the newest COSA draft that changed that I thought was kind of interesting and surprising to me. There was a concern from some lawmakers that the Kids Online Safety Council would be given some kind of substantive authority or power. I believe that there was like just a requirement that the FTC would need to consult with the council before issuing guidance, and that the council didn't have like kind of a finite end date. So that has been kind of like cleaned up, clarified. But I think like the intention of these councils is not to have just like this big body of like unelected people, but really to kind of make sure that regulators and Congress are informed. And so I think that's an idea that we should continue to build on. I don't think I've seen a proposal where councils have like tons and tons of power. But I think that that's really a needed perspective because the FTC has a lot of really substantive expertise on the topics of technology and consumer protection. But they are not children. They do not represent groups that represent children, educators. And so I think I would just continue to amplify that this council, I think, provides a really interesting role in the process.
Totally agreed. Quickly, love the points that have been said already. Don't infantilize. Make sure youth voices that you do listen to are super diverse. Youth is not a monolith. There are a lot of youth councils out there, and they are filled with some excellent people and some very high achievers. Some of them just spoke at our conference on Monday. And not everyone is a star at testifying. So finding sort of listening to the youth-led campaigns that are not just about one charismatic speaker, but like, I don't know, Design It For Us is one movement that kind of comes to mind. And there's a bunch of other groups that have youth involved. But so yeah, I think these are great points about how to include from all levels, government listening, companies listening, advocates listening to youth, incorporating youth.
Absolutely. I could keep going with this conversation all day. It has been fantastic. But I do want to ask one final question just to wrap up. Obviously, COSA, as we've been talking about, is sort of top of mind right now. But whether it's COSA or not, that is of interest to you all. What would you sort of, if you could have your magic wand in hand, what would ideal children's online safety legislation look like to you? And Bailey, you're first up on my screen, so I'm picking on you first, but what would that look like to you?
No, I'm happy to go first and take an easy answer again, which is, I think, comprehensive federal privacy legislation. We at FPF believe that that's really important tool. I think a privacy law that protects everyone, children are part of that everyone group. I don't think that would solve every harm that lawmakers are looking to get after. Again, there's a lot of mental health harms that John touched upon that I don't think data privacy legislation fully solves for. No one is saying it does. But I think we need to kind of start to decouple these issues and think about, okay, what is one harm we can solve for in the near future while we continue to do research and look closely at really tricky laws like COSA. So I would say comprehensive federal privacy legislation.
I think it looks like Shay would agree. Shay?
Yeah, I think, ideally, I would like the first step of this process not to be COSA. I would actually like the first step, to be, these lawmakers. A lot of times it seems to me like the issue really is at its core that legislators believe that youth are spending too much time online. And my response to that, and the first question I would love legislators to answer is, if that is truly your concern, what are you doing to build safe physical spaces for them? I promise an online platform is not the first place that a youth wants to go for community. It just may be the most accessible. Second, that national privacy framework. I think a lot of the protections that are addressed in COSA and bills like it are ones that need to be applied to everyone, that everyone would benefit from. And then after those two steps, I think we can have the conversation about building child-specific protections on top of it.
John?
Yeah, I mean, I think the national privacy law, absolutely. Privacy and data rights are really key and something we don't have in the United States. So would love to see that. I would love to see children's rights being centered more in all legislation, taking a rights first approach rather than some kind of restrictive or safety first approach in every aspect. And I'm gonna again go back to the broken record. Transparency and public interest research, I think, are really pivotal to building good legislation and enforcing good legislation. Something like the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act, which has been stalled, but is a really good step in that direction. If we could get some kind of legislation like that just requires some degree of openness from platforms and companies, and supports and invests in public interest research into these things that we're all so purportedly concerned about.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, all of this is great. Definitely comprehensive federal privacy legislation. As I said before, that could help lower the stakes for age assurance and other online safety laws to be built on top. I definitely echo the transparency and accountability in public interest research. One thing I do like that these updates are doing is that's much better than COPPA 1.0, which is the 13 all or nothing threshold. I like the new terms of minors and recognizing that kids are different as they age and become teens and with more rights and responsibilities and also agency and capacity. So having not, we've already said, not treating it like a monolith, as well as maybe we're talking about lowering the stakes to get it all right in one big, huge, comprehensive bill, but lots of little bills. This should be an issue that we revisit regularly and update. So maybe there's a transparency law that was already flagged. Maybe there's privacy here and safety here. And so, breaking it up a little bit instead of one full swing and then not revisiting it for years or decades.
Well, as I said at the top, I already knew that I had a rock star panel, but I think that was further proved that this was just a fantastic conversation. Really, really appreciate all of your time. And I would encourage the audience to check out the work of all 4 of the organizations we have today, the panelists. I'm a big admirer of their work. I think you will be too if you're not already reading it. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for this fantastic conversation and thank you for tuning in.